We have Eric Tars from the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. We have Dr. Rahul Vanjani from Lifespan's Transition Clinic. And finally, but not least, Beth Shin from Vanderbilt University. So they all have wonderful conversations to have with us today. And I'm so excited to begin with Eric Tars from the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty.
All right, sorry about that. Can you see my screen here? Yep. All right, great. So thank you to Jen and to the University of Rhode Island Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies for hosting this conversation. As Caitlin said, I'm Eric Tars. I'm the legal director at the National Homelessness Law Center, where I've been for the past 15 years working on making housing a human right. And I am thrilled that you all in Rhode Island are taking on housing as a right, and happy to share with you more about why I think it's the right way to go. Okay. Most of you at this conference probably know this, but each year on one cold night in January, our nation counts more than 500,000 people experiencing homelessness, a number which HUD itself acknowledges is a dramatic undercount. And for the first time in 2020, before the pandemic, we saw more than half of the individual count was unsheltered. And since the pandemic, it's likely even worse. And I want to emphasize that this is not just the stereotypical scruffy, mentally ill, possibly addicted adults. It is the more than 1.5 million school students and 9% of college students who were counted, numbers that have gone up every year since counts began. And it's more than doubled what it was in 2003. So if you want a true picture of typical homelessness, it's not that stereotypical adult, it's a 5-year-old child. And while homelessness affects Americans of all races, it impacts Black Americans at 3 times their rate in the population and Indigenous Americans at twice their rate. This is not caused by personal faults in individuals in these communities, but by systemic racial discrimination that started more than 400 years ago and continued to be legal during the lifetimes of people still alive today. This discrimination won't simply disappear on its own, but needs concrete affirmative measures to remedy it. And this is only getting worse with the disparate effects of the COVID pandemic. So we're likely to see a growth of unsheltered homelessness amongst people of color. And my concern is that when communities see more people on the streets, particularly Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, there's more of a push to get them out of public view through criminalization, which further exacerbates the problems we have in this country of mass incarceration. Because of racial disparities in homelessness and enforcement patterns, the criminalization of homelessness isn't just a justice problem, it's a racial justice problem. A recent report found that Black adults are up to 9.7 times more likely to receive citations for low-level non-traffic offenses as white adults. Latinx adults are up to 5.8 times more likely, but most jurisdictions don't collect data on the housing status of individuals charged. So in many cases, while we can look at overall racial trends, we don't see how the intersections of homelessness and race are multiplying each other. And in order to have accountability, we need to know where, when, and how this is happening. So one of the first things we want to talk about is getting a national data collection on this. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would require this for the first time in use of force data collections, but ideally we need it for all encounters with law enforcement. But this is also something that could be taken on at the state level too. Advocates in California right now are working on this. So this is something that that you could be collecting at the in Rhode Island. However, despite the disparate impact of homelessness, as Heather McGee reminds us in The Sum of Us, these policies that disproportionately harm BIPOC communities actually hurt us all. And as you can see here from the Lawyers Committee survey of San Diego enforcement, while BIPOC individuals are disproportionately cited for these criminalization offenses, in absolute terms, white people experiencing homelessness still make up the majority of citations for many of these ordinances. And again, we need the national data so that we can see this all across the country. And because studies have showed that criminalization of homelessness costs 2-3 times much as simply providing housing, continuing to invest these resources into a law enforcement approach to homelessness rather than a housing and services approach actually harms the whole community by draining the resources we need to solve the underlying housing issues that make people homeless in the first place. When housing is viewed as a vehicle for profit, not as a human right, we get 80 to 90% of new housing being constructed as high-end luxury units, not the deeply affordable housing that Americans actually need. These units often sit vacant while people live on the streets, or they force people to pay 50 to 60% of their income every month on rent, putting them just one missed paycheck, one unexpected car repair away from homelessness. The real alternative to criminalization and to housing as a commodity is to make sure that housing is a human right. And that is why it's fantastic that President Biden came in with a message that housing should be recognized as a basic human right to which all Americans are entitled. And why it's really resonating right now that folks like Cori Bush have slept out on the steps of the Capitol, holding the nation's conscience to account for the expiration of the eviction moratorium under a banner of housing as a human right. But what is this human right to housing, and why is it important to talk about it as such? It's not just a rallying slogan, but at the international level, it's a rich source of legal norms that create a comprehensive guarantee of the right. It includes the right to substantive equality, ensuring remedies for historical discrimination in the housing market. It's more than just 4 walls and a roof over your head. It's about the ability to live in dignity and safety. And most critically, it's not just this aspirational language, but a practical tool that advocates can use to actually hold their government accountable. These rights came out of a post-war environment where countries realized that economic rights were just as important as the political rights in preventing the rebirth of fascism. In the words of Franklin Roosevelt, hunger is a breeding ground for tyranny. And so the right to adequate housing was enshrined alongside rights to non-discrimination, to free speech, to fair trials, to education, and many other rights that we take for granted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, because the US was engaged in the Cold War, many of the economic and social rights which were championed by the Soviet states soon took a backseat to other civil and political rights, and we lost the legal sense of obligation to apply these rights domestically. But it's enshrined in these international documents, we can say that the concept of the right to every family to a decent home is as American as apple pie. And it's not that we're introducing something new, but really coming back to this social commitment to one another, that housing is not something that any American should be without. At the international level, the human right to housing is based on this foundation that all human rights are based on, which includes elements of participation, meaning the meaningful participation of those directly impacted by rights violations, equity, accountability, and interdependence. And then, as I said before, it's not just about 4 walls and a roof over your head. The right to housing really takes this approach, takes this comprehensive look at what you need for fully adequate housing. So it's this legal security of tenure, your ability to stay in that home and not be forced out of it. It's about how well there are services, materials, and infrastructure that make your home habitable so that you have access to clean drinking water, that you aren't without fire services or other things that you need to be safe in your home. It's about affordability, and at the international level, affordability isn't just about, whether it's 30% or more of your income, as we talk about in the US, but really, can you live a dignified life and have your other basic human rights ensured? So if you're choosing between adequate food and adequate housing, then paying the rent or paying for food, then that's a violation both of the right to food and of the right to housing. It's about the habitability, the roof over your head, the walls around you, mold, lead paint, all of those things, access to fire escapes and other things that can keep you safe, as we've seen with the recent fires in Philadelphia and New York City and elsewhere. It's about accessibility based on disability, based on race, based on LGBTQ status. It's about the location in the community, environmental racism. Are you located in a community with food deserts? Are there hospitals, other services in the community, good schools? And then finally, cultural adequacy. And whether you are able to fully express yourself in your housing. And all of these things come together. And that's why the human right to housing is such a great organizing tool, because it helps us talk about and bridge together many groups who are working on different issues. So whether your issue is the unaffordability of rent or lead paint or environmental racism, all of these issues can be brought together under the banner of the human right to housing. The right to housing doesn't mean that we have to give every American a free house with a white picket fence tomorrow, but it does create a legal obligation to assess where we are and then take progressive steps to the maximum of our available resources to realize that right. It's not just optional charity, it's a duty on the government, just like the duty to provide a lawyer in a criminal case if somebody can't afford it, in order to guarantee the underlying right of a fair trial. And this is one of the key differences with the rights-based framework is you beg for charity, but you demand your rights. And that's how we need to be framing the conversation around the right to housing. And why is this important? Because where housing is viewed as a right and put into law, it makes real impacts. In Scotland, if you become homeless and you present yourself to the local housing authority, there is a mandatory statutory duty for them to secure you permanent accommodations within 90 days and provide temporary housing in the interim. And because this duty is put on local authorities and incentivizes them to come up with means of preventing homelessness, like a duty on landlords and banks to notify the state ahead of time before somebody loses their housing so that the state can provide interventions. And as a result, we've seen homelessness almost vanish from Scotland's streets. In Finland, they take a different approach. They have a constitutional committee that reviews laws for compliance with their human rights obligations before they get passed. For example, in Opinion 17 of 1997, the committee considered government amendments to legislation that would have allowed subsidies going to social housing for tenants to be restricted for these entities to sell or dispose of the properties in question. And the committee held that these restrictions were designed to secure this good aim of maintaining the provision of state subsidized housing stock. And so it would encourage the passage of this amendment. And this, along with many other steps in Finland, has led to cities with no homelessness on their streets. And so, oops, we're here to have some duplicate slides here. Sorry about that. So what can you do? First, educate yourself on the human right to housing. There's tons of great materials at homelesslaw.org/human-rights, or make-the-shift.org also has some great materials. Step 2 is to have more convenings like this, where we can build consensus and apply the right, thinking about what does the right to housing look like, where is the US and where's Rhode Island right now, what would progressive realization of the right look like, and what resources and policies are needed to achieve this. And then the third step is to make the right real, to take the application of the international framework and turn it into actual legislative language, figure out how you're going to move it through the committee, how you're going to educate the committees and the public about the rights and why they require the policies. Call your elected officials, endorse our National Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, and join with the 3,000 other groups and individuals across the country who are talking about housing as a right, and be in touch if you need anything further. These are all our contact information, and I'm happy to answer more questions later.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was such a comprehensive presentation, and I think really highlighted and set up the stage for our next two presentations. So thank you so much. Just a quick reminder for those that may have joined us a little bit late. We are doing 15 minutes each for each of our wonderful panelists today, and then there'll be 25 minutes at the end for people to ask questions. I am your moderator, so please put questions in the Q&A or in the chat as we go, and I'll keep track and ask at the end.